Parimal, producer and host. And I'm joined here with my good friend and artist in residence, Art Wolfe. Art, how are you?
I'm excellent. Ready to go with my friend Amy.
That's awesome. As a reminder, Earth is Our Witness is a showcase where we invite photographers from all around the world, all genres, with the purpose of going beyond just beautiful images. Yes, the images are beautiful, but we want to go beyond the beautiful images to talk about stories, inspiration, and stories of interconnectedness. And today is a really special one. Please welcome Amy Gulick. Amy, welcome to Earth is Our Witness.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. And it's really exciting to see photography elevated as a way to inspire and connect us. That's what photography does, right? So Thank you for doing this platform. I think it's fantastic.
Great. That's what good photography does. In fact, so the question is, what is today's topic? Let me show a book. Salmon Way. I hope you can all see. The Salmon Way is Amy's latest book. It is about the salmon. Salmon is a fish in the Pacific Northwest and in Alaska. But as you can predict, it's not just about the salmon. Through the stories of the salmon and how it's connected to the people and the land, Amy will also inspire us to talk about and think about salmon as the ultimate metaphor for our own journey in life. So that's the connection. And that's a very intriguing and a fascinating connection. So with that, Amy, can't wait to get started.
All right, well, let's get right into some images. So I need to share my screen here. Do a little bit of technology magic. Okay.
And it
Sorry?
It works. You can see the screen.
All right, I can see it. Fantastic. All right, so the Salmon Way. I just want to talk a little bit about how I came to do this project. So for many decades now, I've been using my photography for the conservation of nature. So what does that mean? Well, it usually means that I go somewhere wild, usually remote. I photograph the land, the rivers, the ocean, the wildlife, and then I come back and I share stories, trying to help people understand why these places are important. And I found that, I don't know, over the last decade or so, I think that's getting increasingly difficult to try and convince people, I think, of why these places that they'll probably never go to and never see, why is this relevant to them? And, I have people say to me things like, I'm not really into nature. I'm not really a nature person. And I always kind of scratch my head at that. And one of my very favorite quotes is by a native Ojibwe man. His name's Richard Wagamis. And he asked an old woman, he said, "Why am I here?" And the old woman looked at him and answered, "Because everything else is." And so I love that quote because it gets us to think about how is it that any of us can live on this earth, and how is it that any human beings since the dawn of time, of human being time, have ever been able to live on this earth. And it's because everything else can. So more and more, I'm starting to use my work to help people understand and think about their own relationship with nature. So a number of years ago, I was in Alaska. This is where I do a lot of my work because Alaska has a lot of very large, intact landscapes and functioning ecosystems. It's probably one of the best places in the world for that. And I was talking with a native Tlingit woman, and she's a master weaver. And so she weaves things out of spruce root and cedar bark. She makes traditional baskets. She weaves beautiful robes out of mountain goat wool. And she lives in this coastal temperate rainforest in Alaska, where her people have thrived, in the forest, on salmon, on deer, on berries, everything that they need. And so I'm watching her weave, and I say to her, with such plentiful resources in your homeland, it's easy to see how your people have been able to thrive. And she stopped what she was doing, and she looked me square in the eye, and she said, "Resources?" She said, "The trees and the salmon and the mountain goat, those aren't resources. We have relationships with the forest and the fish and the animals." And so it was really that conversation that I had with her that got me thinking about, wow, what an incredible difference it makes when we think about the world in terms of resources or relationships. And if we think in terms of resources, then we're going to treat the world very differently than if we think in terms of relationships. So I wanted to take a deep dive into relationships in Alaska. And so I chose salmon as a way to do this because a lot of people in Alaska have some kind of relationship with salmon. So this is where our story begins, in fresh water, very cool, clear, clean fresh water. This is where salmon start their lives. Now, you can't see the salmon here, but they're there. They are buried underneath this gravel. They're in a nest, and it's called a redd. This is where their parents deposited the fertilized eggs. And they're buried beneath the gravel because that protects the eggs while they develop from being eaten. So the next stage of their life, when salmon, when the eggs hatch, this is the next phase of their life, and they're called Albins at this stage. I love that name for them. You still wouldn't see them though. They'd be buried beneath the gravel. They're tiny at this stage. They're no bigger than a thumbnail. But I really wanted people to see this stage of their life, even though we would never see this in the wild. So I actually had to go into a hatchery and set up a little kind of portable photography studio in order to make this image. But what I love about this, so what you're seeing is, you're seeing the body of the salmon has popped out of that egg, but the yolk sac of the egg is still attached to the body. And so this is what the little baby salmon right now are feeding on. They're being nourished by the nutrients that are in that yolk sac. And eventually that yolk sac gets absorbed into their body, and they really start to look like little miniature salmon then, and then they emerge from the gravel.
This is a really strong image. This is really beautiful. The veins in the yolk sac. I mean, you did a great job on recording not an easy subject. And were you using a light box below these fish?
I did. That's a great question. Yes. And it took a lot of experimentation. This was not an easy one to make at all. I was able to get, some of these little Albins out of the hatchery and put them in a little glass Petri dish, put the Petri dish on a light box, and then had a little light tent surrounding it so that I could light it. Really, the lighting was, of course, the hardest part.
Wow.
But yeah, I just absolutely. And again, we would never, ever see this in the wild. So I thought it was really important for all of us to just see what they look like.
I got to say, as you talk about the, I love the way you phrase the whole thing in such a simple way, which is not resources, but relationships. It just changes everything, doesn't it?
Everything. I mean, just think about, and I always encourage people, like in your everyday life, catch yourself when you start saying the word resources or natural resources. Just replace it with relationships and see how your mind shifts, and how you're thinking about things. I do that all the time now, and I try and encourage other people to do it. So anyway, so the salmon are, again, they're just hatched, they've come out of the egg, and then they emerge from the gravel. And then, for those of you who aren't very familiar with the salmon life cycle, the life cycle itself is pretty amazing. So they're still in their fresh water, but then, so they grow a little bit, they're little tiny fish, they grow a little bit bigger, and then they leave fresh water. So they leave their streams, their rivers where they were born, and they go to the ocean. So they're going from fresh water to salt water. So why do they do this? Well, they go to the ocean because that's where they're going to find a lot of food. And that's where they're going to be able to grow into these big, gorgeous, silver, bright salmon. So I knew I was going to be spending a lot of time with people and a diversity of people, again, to try and explore these relationships that people have with salmon. And one of the first families I spent time with was a commercial fishing family. So these are people who catch salmon and sell them for a living. So I was on their boat and I was observing, watching what they're doing, and they're catching a lot of fish. The fish are getting hauled out of the water. They're beautiful, they're bright, they're silver. And very quickly they're out of the water, their head gets cut off, they get, split open, they're bled, they're gutted. And when I very first started this project, my heart kind of sank to my feet when I was watching this, because I panicked a little bit. I'm like, what have I gotten myself into? how on earth am I going to make images that are striking and engaging and help tell this beautiful story when I'm surrounded by blood and guts and admittedly a scene that is not very appealing. And so Art, this is something that I hear you talk a lot about in photography. It's how do we open our mind to be able to see past what we're just initially seeing on the surface and find the beauty and find it no matter where we are. And so I quickly realized that that's what I had to do. And I had to work really hard in order to see past a scene that really was not terribly appealing at first. But once I was able to do that and open my mind, oh my gosh, the beauty was everywhere. But your voice was in my head quite a bit about that because it's something you talk about a lot. And so here again, just the beautiful colors of the salmon, the iridescence of the eye, they are just remarkable creatures. If you can really,
I think your choice of the word iridescent is so appropriate because that eye and the color in it just illuminates, doesn't it? And they're like, I've seen so many artists now, including what's on the wall behind you. They're such an exquisite subject for art. They are really beautiful fish.
They are, and in every phase of their life cycle. And I'll show some more there. Okay, so one of the main relationships that many people in Alaska have with salmon is through commercial fishing. So again, these are people who are catching salmon and selling them, and this is how they make their living. And this particular spot in Alaska, this is Bristol Bay, Alaska. Bristol Bay is one of the most prolific, abundant, rich places on the planet for salmon. It is home to the largest run of wild sockeye salmon in the entire world. The commercial fishery here is incredibly intense. And it's intense because there's such an abundance of fish. On average, there's 33 million sockeye are returning to this bay every year, and they're heading into one of 9 rivers, major rivers that feed into this bay. And so 33 million fish on average. The year I was there, 60 million fish were coming into this bay. And they come in a very short amount of time. So 80 to 90% of the entire run in Bristol Bay, it shows up in just 3 weeks. So you have commercial fishermen who are making a substantial part of their annual income on this Bristol Bay fishery in just 3 weeks, maybe a month. So it's incredibly intense. And I spent time on the water, I spent time on the land. You could really feel the energy of all the boats out there and all the people rushing and racing, to try and catch these fish in a short amount of time. But it was really hard to translate that energy into a photograph from the water, from the land. So I figured out I had to get up into the air in order to really get a sense and make an image that helps people understand the intensity and the chaos and just the frenzy, of this fishery. So, here we've got nets, sometimes like a football field in length, just streaming out behind these boats. And to me, they just look like long strings of pearls. But, you've got other boats, cutting across these nets. You've got boats, coming at each other, hitting each other from time to time. It's a really intense fishery. And I will say Bristol Bay has been in the news quite a bit. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about this. So the world's largest open pit gold mine is being proposed in the world's largest sockeye salmon fishery at the headwaters of 2 of the most important rivers that feed into this bay. This proposal has been going on for about 15 years now. We got some very good news last week. The federal permit that this mining proposal needed to get underway, to really get going, was denied. So so really good news. And for now, Bristol Bay is safe, but we'll probably see, another attempt. So just keep vigilant. That's what I tell folks.
It's so interesting, Amy, that people that drive this from a personal monetary reason work day and night because they're after their own self monetary. And people like you and me that are driven by the environment and the greater good. Yeah, I mean, it's always comes down to that. That Pebble Creek or Pebble Mine, that's a Canadian company, isn't it? That's behind that too.
Yes. International mining company. Yes. And, Art, that brings up a great point. So commercial fishermen, again, I didn't grow up, being a commercial fisherman. Many people do who fish, like they grew up as children, their parents fish, their grandparents fish, so it's a culture that they're very familiar with. And I think I just assumed wrongly that was kind of all people cared about, was kind of the monetary, value of this fishery. And certainly it's important. I mean, this is how they make their living, but I was amazed that the relationship that the commercial fishermen had with salmon was one of deep love. And I would hear this over and over again. They'd say to me, "Oh, I love these fish." And so here they love these fish and they're killing these fish. And I thought, wow, those are two kind of hard concepts to keep in your mind at one time. But they described it very well. I think when you live very closely to something and you've got this deep relationship, whatever it may be, but it's this relationship that you have with salmon, there's a reverence there. There's a deep respect, for the fish, for their life, for what they're going through, for what it takes, you to go through to catch them. I heard that over and over again. And I also learned just how incredibly difficult and often dangerous commercial fishing is. It is both physically and mentally exhausting. But the other thing I love about it, and the other thing that commercial fishermen really emphasize to me that they love about it, is the second that you get on that boat and you leave land and you're out there, chasing these fish, this is no longer a 9-to-5 job. It is no longer, you're not on a human time frame anymore. You are on the clock of salmon. Salmon show up when salmon want to show up. They show up when the conditions are right. So if you're a commercial fisherman trying to find salmon, if the salmon are moving at 1 a.m, that's when you're going to be out fishing. If the tides are at midnight, because the salmon are driven by the tides, or the tides help the salmon move, so you quickly fall into this rhythm, this natural rhythm, and you're moving on nature's time frame and at nature's pace. And when you think about it, this is how human beings have always lived. It's really only until recently, really the Industrial Revolution, that we really started living, by a clock and not by nature's seasons and the rhythm. So fishermen very much are tied to the ocean, the weather, the tides, the water temperature, and they're very in tune to these things. And so again, this is a connection for them to living within nature, and it's beautiful.
I'm sorry, Amy, you're a great, eloquent person, but I do want to make a comment about this photo before you move on. There's no fisherman in this shot, and yet the way those boots are draped over that windowsill conveys tired workers. It conveys exhausted people without seeing the exhausted people. So it's quite clever how those boots are just kind of laying there and muddy. And I definitely love the graphic nature of the gloves standing out from that dark window. So it's nice to see the way you're portraying this subject with details and abstraction. And I know you'll have a lot of salmon in the book, but this is the mind of somebody that really knows what they're doing. They're telling the story in not such an obvious way.
Right. And again, I like I said at the beginning, I did panic when I started this project, because that was my challenge. It's like, how do I tell this story in not an obvious way? And how do I honor all these different relationships that people have?
And also, I love this image. And Amy, as you and I were talking, it's a pure coincidence, right? In some ways, but interesting that the color of the gloves and also the walls is sort of the salmon in many ways too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you open my book, it's amazing how many orange pictures there are, whether it's people's rain gear, their gloves, the salmon themselves. It's, yeah, there's definitely an orange theme going on. So again, you know, this is another thing when you're on a commercial fishing boat, or if you are around commercial fishing, you're going to be around a lot of fish. And that means you're going to be around, and if you yourself are doing these things, and I actually did crew with a commercial fisherman for a few days just to see what it's like. And you are going to be covered in blood and guts and salt water. And most of all, you're going to be covered in scales. And if you've ever had fish scales attached to you, they'll be in your hair, they're on your skin, they're on your clothes, they're on the boat, they're on everything. And it doesn't matter how much you scrub yourself. It's really hard to get scales off or get all of them off, especially when they dry. So you could think, ew, sticky, icky scales. Or again, you can look past, you know, what you're seeing on the surface and see the absolute beauty of these scales. And again, commercial fishermen were telling me, you know, again, I kill these fish, but I love them. I mean, look at their tails. They're, you know, look at these scales. They're like little jewels, you know, the purple and the silver and little flecks of gold. And, you know, it's kind of like nature's perfect design.
Beautiful image.
Yeah. So this is probably the relationship that I probably appreciated the most, and one I knew the least about, but really came to respect and admire. And this is the relationship that Alaska Native people have with salmon and have had for thousands and thousands of years. So this woman, her name is Shelley, and I'm in her smokehouse. And what she's doing is what people have been doing, again, her people have been doing for thousands of years. They're putting up food. And so we started to have this conversation. So here she's putting up king salmon, and she's putting it, again, to dry in her smokehouse. So we started to talk, and she told me, she said, I was always taught to be ready, to have food for the winter. I feel poor when I don't have food put up, and I feel good when my smokehouse is filled, because then I know I have enough. And so just those words alone really made me think. It made me think about, wow, you know, what is wealth? What is happiness? What is a life? You know, what is a living? And Shelley and many other Alaska Native people that I spent time with, they all told me that they feel rich. They feel rich when their smokehouse is filled, when they have food put up for the winter. And so this word rich kept coming up and coming up. And again, it really made me think about, how do we define wealth? They are rich. And what they mean by rich is, I have enough food for the winter. You know, my family is, you know, we're set, we're secure. And so to them, you know, salmon is, it's, and especially, you know, putting it up like this, it's long-term security. It's how many of us maybe in the Western, more industrialized world, it's how we would think of, you know, enough money in the bank. You know, this is how they think of salmon. And so when they say that they're rich, you know, again, those of us in the Western world, we tend to think of, well, rich means, you know, material wealth. And that's not how they mean it at all. And so again, I really came to appreciate this way of life. And it's humbling, really humbled me, because it made me realize, it's like, I don't think a whole lot about my food. And I certainly don't have to spend all my entire summers, you know, putting up food for the winter. But think about what that does. If you're spending your time, if you're spending your summer doing this, guess what? You have a deep connection, you know, to those fish. You have an appreciation for what they're doing for you. And I heard this over and over too. You know, when you live that closely, you know, to the land, the waters, and, you know, the fish, you also have a deep appreciation for what's taking care of you. And so I heard this often. It's like, you know, you take care of what takes care of you. So they take care of the spawning streams, the rivers, you know, what the salmon need to live. But they also take care of, you know, their smokehouses. Those are fixed up before the salmon come in. They take care of their boats. They mend their nets, all their gear that it's going to take, you know, to catch the salmon. And they take care of themselves. They get enough sleep, they're taking care of their families. So it's like, wow, it's like, you're learning life's lessons from living closely to the fish. And I just found that was just beautiful.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And so the other thing that I would hear often from Alaska Native people is this idea that, they have been living this way. Again, they would tell you since time immemorial, literally thousands and thousands of years. So how do they know how to do this? How have they lived this way? How have their people survived? And again, it's in part through salmon. So this woman here, she's with her grandson. And so he's learning what his ancestors going, millennia back have done. And so this is being carried on today. And the other thing I loved is that they all told me, they said, our children learn by watching. We don't sit there and talk to them and tell them how to do things. They learn by watching us. I heard that over and over again. And so this is their school. They don't go sit in a classroom and learn how to catch and clean and dry and cut salmon. They learn by being there. And from the time they're babies, they are with their families at fish camp during the salmon season. And so they grow up helping, watching, and then when it comes time for them to be catching and cutting and doing, the jobs that the adults are doing, they know how to do it.
On that note, they learn by watching. It's interesting you mentioned. I read somewhere kids don't learn based on what you preach or lecture to them. They ultimately learn by watching the parents and the elders and the surroundings. And in some ways, what you said earlier is having that value system where you don't look at things as resources, but as relationships. I'm sure that's what the kids are also learning. At least that's my hope.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's everyone's hope. And again, another example, Art, of what you talk about a lot. It's how do you see past the surface of what your brain's seeing and open your mind and just see the absolute beauty in what could otherwise be a very mundane scene. This was photographed in a fish camp area in an old abandoned cannery where fishermen come and they just spend about 3 weeks. This is in the Bristol Bay area, and they live in these old abandoned buildings and they take their boats out every day, and then they're bringing their salmon back and they're drying it. This is for their personal use. And again, it's kind of hard to get past all the junk, all the rust that's laying around, just all the clutter, and then you stumble across something like this. Sorry.
It is so beautiful. It's luminescent. I love the colors, but then I also love the bottom portion of this, that abstraction of the shadows and the wire is really quite nice. Very nice.
Yeah, the shadows, I think, are what, just stood out and blared, come photograph me. and this part of the world, it's not often sunny. And when I was there, it was okay weather, but normally it isn't. Normally it's cold, wet, windy, rainy, and so I had a streak of some good weather, but it was overcast most of the time. And I was kind of walking by the scene, and the sun just peeked out, and those shadows did not last long at all.
But the color of the green and the red is so vibrant that it's really both sides. My eyes keep rotating around the entirety of this composition. It just works on many different levels. Really nice, beautiful.
And so another relationship that Alaskans have with salmon. So if you're not a commercial fisherman, catching them and selling them, if you're not Alaska Native, where the bulk of your diet and your entire culture revolves around salmon, Alaskans still, they get out and they're able to, fish and catch a certain number. Most people try and get out and fill their freezer for the winter. And so again, this is how they're spending their time, or their weekends, or their time off of, another job. And so they're very connected, to the salmon, to their rivers, to their streams. But I think really it's like, there's probably no better way that you could be connected, to nature and the things that are sustaining us when you are catching fish and filling, your larder for the winter, and you're right next to a bear who's doing the exact same thing that you are.
It is. It is. It's like a level playing field. I mean, in the end, we are the same in some ways. We, the bears, want the same thing.
Yeah, and it's, and you can view yourself as competition too. It's right. Oh, that bear's taking my salmon, and I'm sure the bear probably views us as competition too. But it's when the salmon are running and they're abundant, it's like kind of everybody's friends because everyone's catching enough.
I've seen in Brooks Camp bears that have learned to wait for a fisherman to have a fish on the line, and then they'll charge the fisherman and grab the fish. And bears are very smart creatures. But I think in this particular case, there's enough food for everybody. The bear is pretty chill.
Yeah. Yeah.
My term is chill. The two species that we know on planet, they're both chill, being in the same, nearby areas. It's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see this a lot. This is not an isolated incident. I mean, when salmon are coming in, there's a lot of bears around, and there are a lot of people, trying. Everyone, again, that salmon are feeding a lot of different species. So again, this is fairly common. So this image, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about it. So this is where pre-visualization can really help us make an image. And Art, I know you talk a lot about this. So I had an idea in my head of what I wanted to do, but it doesn't mean it was going to happen, because it was going to rely on things that were completely beyond my control. But at least I had the idea and the concept in my head. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to create an image that spoke to this idea of salmon as a life force. And because at every stage of their life cycle, from the egg to that little alvin to when they're little tiny fish, all the way out to mature adults, and they're feeding something at every single stage, whether it's bears, birds, sea lions, seals, orcas, people. They feed so many different things. And so I wanted to create an image that spoke to that, salmon as a life force. And this is actually, I found, quite difficult, because the second salmon are caught, there might be a second when they're still alive and still vibrant, but then they're quickly killed, whether it's by a bear or a human. So I needed to make an image that showed a live, vibrant salmon feeding something else. And I had an idea of where I wanted to go to do this. And I knew I wanted to do this with bears and salmon. But Art, as you know, I know you photograph bears and salmon quite a bit. It's really hard when you've got this big, furry, charismatic mammal with a lot of teeth that we tend to fear a bit, and we certainly respect this animal. It's really hard to make an image to where the bear isn't the star of the show. And usually the fish is just kind of a prop, and it kind of gets lost, with that bear. And so I knew I was going to have to get pretty close to the bear and use a long lens, of course, in order to try and have the salmon as the star of the show. And I really wanted the bear to take a back seat to the salmon. So I went to a place called McNeil River. It's a wonderful place because only 10 people are allowed in for 4 days at a time. So I knew I wouldn't be crowding and jockeying for position with hundreds of other photographers. And I knew I'd have the time to just sit there. Because you are very confined to where you can be. So you get to this spot where bears are fishing, you sit down and you stay there for 8 hours, for 4 days in a row. So I knew I might have a good chance of being fairly close. So when I look at this image, I mean, a part of me, my heart kind of breaks, and it breaks because salmon's journey is what I call a hero's journey. When you come to understand their life cycle, again, from an egg to the little alvin to the little fish, they leave fresh water, they go out to the ocean to mature, then they come back, they leave the ocean, they come back to their spawning streams and their fresh water. If they've survived all of that, that's absolutely remarkable. I mean, so many salmon get eaten somewhere along the way, or, caught by people. And so here is this beautiful female chum salmon in her gorgeous spawning colors. And she's survived all of that. And now she's come back. You know, what she's going to do now, what she's trying to do now is lay her eggs, have a male fertilize those eggs, and then she's going to die. That's the life cycle of Pacific salmon. So she's very close, you know, to completing basically her mission in life. And here comes this bear and snatches her out of the creek. And she's so ripe with eggs that you know, the minute that the clamp of the bear's jaws, you know, bear down on her body, this forces her eggs from her body. And so in a way, to me, this is very sad. You know, she wasn't able to pass on her genes and complete this heroic journey. But at the minute that this happens, her life force is being transferred to his. So while this is a rather sad ending for her, at the same time, it's like she's still passing on life. She's just passing on life to a different species. And so in that respect, I think it's an absolutely beautiful story of again, what this fish means to life in general.
It's an amazing moment. The bear's tooth is very orange. So, but yeah, it's a great moment. And as because the eye of the bear is dark and it's there, but it doesn't take away from the salmon. The salmon and the spray of those eggs are so, by contrast, so out front. And yeah, I think you succeeded on your pre-visualization, as you call it. It's really quite nice. So
Amy,
10 photographers for 4 days now, huh? You know,
Yeah.
back in the day, you could go in there and back in the early 80s, I went up there a couple of years in a row, but then it became a lottery. It's a great place.
It is. It's, yes. If you can win that lottery, it's still one of my favorite places.
it's a powerful image. Amy, I loved, you're a great speaker. I gotta say, when you were narrating that story about this, I literally got goosebumps because you're right. I could relate to that. The hero's life, the moment of sadness of the death, and then you talk about the other side of that death is, you know, the other way of looking at it is even in dying, she is giving. And back, Art, to you about what you mentioned that we can all learn from is there's the larger good. It's not just about us individuals all the time. It's such a powerful story.
Well, you know, Amy, a couple of images back said that, you know, there's so many different things that feed on the salmon, but as it decays and its nutrients feed the vegetation along the creeks, it affects the entire environment around the salmon. It's not just the mammals or birds or even other fish that would eat the small fry. It's death, you know, enriches the environment, plants and animals.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, there are salmon in the trees. And if you invite me back, I will tell you that story.
I was about to say that. I got to say, if this story doesn't, you know, compel us to get this book, I don't know what else will. And Amy, you were right. I know we still have a few more images to go, but we would love to have you back to talk about your other book, Salmon in the Trees, which exactly as Art mentioned, could be another fascinating and inspiring conversation.
Yeah. And I will say, you know, one more thing, just about the story of this image. It's, you know, again, I spent a lot of time on salmon spawning streams, and, you know, this certainly was not the only salmon I watched die, you know, just before it had, you know, completed its ultimate, you know, mission in life. I watched thousands and thousands and thousands. And the more you watch this, it's, you know, and you're watching this salmon, you know, just giving it everything it's got. I mean, they do not stop swimming upstream against this current until they reach the spawning grounds and until they die. It's just that the will and the determination, you know, to persist is quite strong. But when you watch this over and over again, it's like you cannot help but think about your own life and your own journey. And what are you giving, and what are you benefiting, and what do you pass on, you know, once you're gone? Again, that's that metaphor. And I think about my own life a lot because of salmon. and what they give.
So profound.
So here we've got, all right, so again, the salmon, when they're adults and they leave the ocean and they enter freshwater again, they're coming into their spawning streams, and they change. Their body completely changes. They change into their spawning colors, and depending on the species, they're going to look different in their spawning colors. And the male's body changes. They get a pronounced hump on their back. They have a real hook snout. And that helps them fight other males in order to compete for the females. I think these are some of the prettiest salmon in their spawning colors. These are sockeye salmon. They're the ones that turn bright red and green heads. And when you see them just streaming in these big pulses and clumps of fish into their streams, they really look to me like pulses of blood. And in a good way, you know, I mean, blood is life. And I heard a lot of people say that over and over. It said salmon are our lifeblood. These rivers are our lifeblood. And so I wanted to make an image that spoke to that concept, that salmon as a lifeblood.
Yeah, and you know, it's really interesting. This is a prime example of where you intentionally took a longer exposure to convey a sense of pulsing and movement, and yet that one eye in that salmon in center right is the eye that we go to, because it's a reference from which the rest of the image can be wildly out of focus. So it's beautifully done, because that one sharp eye is all it took to complete this entire image, to me.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Art, for noticing that. Yeah, because, you know, obviously I have many, many, many images, and you're right, using a slow shutter speed to try and get this idea of pulsing and movement. And there were plenty where you really couldn't see an eye. And so this is definitely the one I picked just for that reason.
It's you know, it looks easy, and yet, you know, Art, as you said, that one eye breaks that image in some ways. That would be the difference between a professional Amy like you and Art and someone who, you know, is still learning or on that journey. Makes a huge difference.
It looks just like a painting, of course.
Yeah.
So this is another relationship that people have with salmon. And admittedly, this is the relationship I struggled with the most. So this is sport fishing, you know, fishing for recreation. And I think I struggled with it because, you know, I have sport fished before and I've enjoyed it, but I don't live, breathe, eat, sleep, you know, and die, you know, to sport fish. And so I was trying to get into the heads of sport fishermen and understand this relationship. And as a good friend of mine who was an avid fly fisherman, he said to me, he said, Amy, it's not so much about the fish, it's about where the fish take you. And that really helped me understand. It's like, oh, I mean, of course. And so, you know, here we've got a fly fisherman who's on this absolutely gorgeous stream, fishing. And I will say, so fly fishermen in general, they're not targeting the salmon. They're not fishing. They're not here for the salmon, but they are here because of the salmon. So the fish that they're targeting are rainbow trout and Dolly Varden that grow really big and fat, because those fish are feasting on the salmon eggs, the little baby salmon, the carcasses from the adult salmon once they die. So there's a lot of other species in here that are following the salmon, and that's usually what the fly fishermen are going for. So in order to do that, though, they're going to be on these salmon spawning streams when the salmon are just pulsing through, you know, again, trying to catch these other fish. And it's like, I mean, again, they're in beautiful settings. They are in the moment. So many fishermen told me that, you know, fishing for them is a form of meditation. It's when they're the most present. You know, they can leave their phone behind and any kind of worries and schedules. Again, you're not on a human clock. You know, you're on the clock of the river. You're on the clock of nature. You're paying attention to weather. You know, so you are deeply connected to the things, you know, that are enabling, you know, the salmon and the other fish to be there. And I quickly came to, I got it. You know, again, for a relationship I was struggling with, I'm like, okay, I get it.
No, I totally get it because I've seen them every year as we lead tours up to Alaska. And I don't think I've ever seen fishermen walking down with fish. They catch and they release. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I have no issues whatsoever. And in fact, I would say it was because so many of these fishermen or their grandfathers started fly fishing. You know, the bears that we photograph have long been habituated by the fishermen that are not hunting them. And so the bears become pretty relaxed around humans. And I will attribute that to these sport fishermen, or at least their ancestors.
Mhm. Yep. Yep.
And it trains the salmon to give a wide berth to a human because that's what they need to do when the bears are in the river.
Right.
This is beautiful. This is really quite nice.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why wild salmon are still so prolific and abundant in Alaska is because their habitat, what they need to live and survive, is largely intact. So this is just a very, very small piece of the Copper River Delta in Alaska. The Copper River is about 300 miles long. You may know of that name, but Copper River salmon is a very popular and very delicious salmon that comes down in about mid-May, comes down, is shipped down. Commercial fishermen are catching it in Alaska, it gets shipped down to the lower 48 and probably all over the world as well. So this is, again, a part of this delta that they're weaving through. And so so this is at the mouth of the river. And when I look at this image, I like to look at all the blue waterways. And I think of this landscape as like a beating heart. And all of those blue waterways are arteries, you know, of life, you know, that are weaving, you know, through this heart. And these arteries are the pathways, you know, that allow the salmon, the lifeblood, you know, to pulse through these waterways, bringing life, you know, to so many different things. So again, this is just a nod to this is what healthy salmon habitat looks like.
So do you know why the Copper River salmon are so tasty?
Yes. So salmon, yes, that's a great question. All salmon are not created equal, as I've learned. So the Copper River, again, is 300 miles long. That's a long river for salmon. There are others that are longer. The Yukon River is 2,000 miles long. But the Copper, so the length of the river has a lot to do with the type of salmon that can make that journey. The Copper, in addition to being a long river, it's also a really big, mighty, strong, swift river. So think of the fitness level of that fish. Think of how big and tough and strong that fish has to be to make it 300 miles against a very strong current. They don't eat once they hit fresh water and return to their spawning stream. So they've just got to be in top-notch shape to be able to make that journey. And top-notch shape means size, and it means that they have to build up a lot of fat, again, in order to survive that journey, because they're not eating once they hit that fresh water. And the fat, this healthy fat, these omega-3s, this is what makes salmon so tasty. So yes, that is exactly what makes a Copper River salmon so delicious, is the length and the strength of that river.
On my first trip to Alaska, I floated the river. It took 12 days. And so you're, yeah, and back when I did it, there were so many icebergs because there's so many glaciers that feed the river. And partially, I think that and what you just said, the swift and strong river means fat on the salmon. So it's not only big and robust, but it's also super cold. And so that fat, I think, helps the salmon, or at least that's the speculation. But I love this image. I just gave a talk on aerials, and I think this is really quite beautiful. And in the fall, isn't it? This is taken in when the
this was, believe it or not, this was early. This was in May. This was or maybe June. Yeah, it was June. You know, so right, so the greenery, so the things on the delta, like the sedges, the grasses, they're just starting to green up.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what's really making the color there.
Beautiful.
And so here we have the adult salmon. This is at the very end of their lives. This is one who, completed that heroic journey, came back to its spawning stream, spawned, and then died. And again, that's the life cycle of Pacific salmon. After spawning, they die. And so jokingly, people always say, if you're a salmon, there's no such thing as safe sex. If you spawn, you're going to die. But all joking aside, again, I spent a lot of time on spawning streams and I saw a lot of dead salmon. And when you are amidst all of this death, and you're not just seeing, and again, here's the salmon, its flesh is decaying from its body, a seagull, or an eagle, ripped its eyeball out. It's in tatters, it's in shreds. And it's really easy, again, to arrive, let's say, at a spawning stream when a lot of salmon are dying. And because now you're smelling that too, decaying fish have a very strong odor. So you're smelling it, you're seeing death. And, if you didn't open your mind again and really see that that this is a beautiful story and that there's beauty in death, you'd miss. You'd miss such a large piece of this story. And as Art was saying earlier, it's not just the animals and the other wildlife that are feeding on the fish, that especially now when they're decaying, the nutrients, from the bodies, they find their way onto land, they nourish the soil, they fertilize plants. But here's the amazing thing too, the nutrients and the carcasses, the bits of flesh from the carcass are also feeding the young salmon. So the parents are not only giving their life in the form of fertilized eggs, now they're giving their bodies to the next generation. It's like, and if that doesn't make you think about your own life and what you're leaving behind, and how are you benefiting the world, I don't know what will.
They give in life when alive, they give while dying, they give after dead.
They sure do. And then ultimately, what are they leaving behind? They're leaving behind the next generation. So here are those fertilized eggs developing. They'd be underneath the gravel. Again, we would never see fertilized eggs in the wild, but here they are. And so this cycle of life, is complete for the salmon, but it's a circle, and it starts all over again. And so I think the egg itself, just denoting this circle, this beautiful cycle of life, is a good way to end the images.
I agree. I think that previous image of the dead salmon is extraordinarily beautiful and haunting. Without the eye, they have such a strong and graphic eye. Without that eye, you really get the sense that it's gone. It's left the planet, and it's almost metallic again. So lovely graphic images, and are such a strong sense of art throughout the work you've shown.
Oh, thank you. It was, again, at the very beginning, I was panicked. I'm like, how am I going to make art, out of blood and guts and chaos and not necessarily beautiful scenes? But that's also the beauty of, stop my share. I think that's the beauty of being able to spend a lot of time and working on a book instead of, having 10 days to try and get enough images to maybe illustrate a magazine story. I love the depth that a book allows you to go and maybe go back to the same place a number of times and really try and get it right. And as you're working on a book, Art, as it's like you just keep going deeper and deeper into your topic. And I think that's when that's when the magic happens, I think. And that's when you can create art.
It's a sad day when the final deadline for the last photos are in. And yeah, I am shooting to that last moment and beyond. But,
yes, totally agree. And even once the book is out, I'm still shooting, right? It's like, oh, there's an image I wish I had, but now I have it. Maybe I can use it some other way, but yes.
That's for the reprint. That's the updated new version of the song. Lovely. Well done. Really well done, Amy. Very happy to do this work. And a beautiful book.
Beautiful book. I got to say one more time, love this book, and I am fascinated by the stories that you talked about, Amy. As we wrap this up, a question for both of you, starting with you, Art, and then Amy, is seeing this body of work, what comes to you in terms of an overall message you feel, or a learning or inspiration for all of us?
Well, I think the message is for other aspiring photographers to take a subject, but look at it from all different points of view and scales. And Amy did it. I mean, she showed humans without humans in the frame. She showed details of the salmon, and it could have been anything. She really challenged herself to enrich the book and the body of work with a great pacing. And I think a lot of aspiring photographers could take a lot from that lead that she's just demonstrated.
Thank you, Art. Amy, any final thoughts for what you think is a big takeaway for all of us, humanity, based on this and your work?
Oh, yes. Well, for humanity, I think I always hope that somehow, and in this case through salmon, but really in anything, examine your own life. And it's, if we can somehow connect to our true nature, and I do think our true nature is connected to nature, whether you think you're a nature person or not, it's deep within us, that wild part of our DNA. I think for many people in the modern industrialized world, is just kind of taking a nap. But it's still there. So somehow if we can connect to our true nature and realize that we are here because everything else is, then I think we can't help but then look at the world and take care of what takes care of us, and think in terms of relationships instead of resources.
Love that. If people want to find out more about the book, what's the best way for them to get their book or find out more about the book, The Salmon Way?
The easiest way is probably go to the website, thesalmonway.org.
Great. Okay. Well, with that, I just want to wrap it up. I love this. As I said earlier when we started, our goal was to go beyond images. Nothing against images. I mean, images are obviously by professionals, they're always beautiful. But anytime we transcend that to talk about inspiration or stories of interconnectedness, I think it just elevates things to a much, much deeper level. And Amy, you've just done that. I love the metaphor for salmon as the hero, what we can learn. I love the knowledge sharing that you did, Art's contribution in terms of the artistic, composition and techniques, and how that can make a big difference. And in life they're giving, while dying they're giving, after death they're still giving. That's just an amazing way of looking at life in itself for all of us. So with that, thank you, Art. Thank you, Amy. And thank you for everyone tuning in. Do share this with your friends and family, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube or Instagram. And check out Amy's book on thesalmonway.org. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Parimal. And
Thank you
Amy.
both.
All right. See you guys.